December 15th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Temperature hovering just above freezing, with fog so thick that visibility dropped to less than 50 meters in places. A German mechanized column, comprising 17 half-tracks, 9 supply trucks, and 4 armored reconnaissance vehicles, advanced through what intelligence reports assured them was a lightly defended agricultural sector. The commanding officer, Hauptmann Friedrich Werner, of the 216th Reconnaissance Battalion, studied his maps with confidence, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid morning air as he traced their route with a gloved finger. According to every briefing, every aerial photograph, every prisoner interrogation, this route represented the path of least resistance through Allied lines. The farmland they approached had been abandoned weeks earlier, its Belgian owners having fled west ahead of the German advance. What could possibly threaten a fully armed convoy in the middle of empty fields? Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Werner and his 37 soldiers could not have imagined was that their entire convoy would vanish within the next 6 hours, not from artillery strikes or tank battles, but because of a strategy devised by a 62-year-old farmer who had never fired a weapon in combat, using nothing more sophisticated than rope, local geography, and an intimate knowledge of soil composition that would prove more devastating than any minefield. This is the story of how traditional agricultural wisdom, dismissed and underestimated by military professionals, accomplished what battalions of soldiers might have struggled to achieve. The man responsible for what German intelligence would later classify as the Ardennes disappearance incident was Samuel Morrison, a black American farmer from rural Mississippi who had spent 4 decades working land that most people considered worthless. Born in 1882 to parents who had been enslaved until the end of the Civil War, Morrison grew up understanding that survival depended on extracting productivity from whatever resources were available. The land his family eventually purchased in 1898, after 16 years of sharecropping and saving every possible penny, consisted of 40 acres of delta bottomland that white farmers had rejected as too wet, too prone to flooding, too difficult to drain properly. Morrison spent his youth learning to read the subtle signs that distinguish temporarily saturated soil from permanently waterlogged ground, understanding how underground clay layers directed water flow, recognizing which crops could tolerate high water tables and which required better drainage. By the time he was 20, he could look at a field and predict with uncanny accuracy how it would respond to rainfall, where water would pool, where it would drain, and what modifications would be needed to make cultivation practical. This wasn't theoretical knowledge learned from textbooks, but practical wisdom, earned through constant observation, experimentation, and the occasional costly failure when assumptions proved wrong. The Mississippi Delta, where Morrison farmed, presented unique challenges that forced farmers to develop sophisticated understanding of hydrology and soil mechanics. The region sat atop complex geology, layers of alluvial deposits laid down by thousands of years of river flooding, creating inconsistent soil profiles where clay, sand, silt, and organic matter interleaved in patterns that varied dramatically across short distances. What appeared to be uniform farmland from the surface might contain radically different substrates just meters apart, with corresponding differences in drainage, load-bearing capacity, and agricultural productivity. White farmers in the region generally had access to better land, parcels that had been surveyed and graded, with established drainage systems and soil amendments that made cultivation relatively straightforward. Black farmers like Morrison typically worked marginal land that required constant attention and sophisticated management just to remain productive. This created a peculiar dynamic. Black farmers often developed deeper practical expertise about difficult soil conditions because their survival depended on it, yet this expertise was systematically devalued by a social system that assumed black farmers were less competent than their white counterparts. Morrison experienced this devaluation constantly throughout his farming career. County agricultural extension agents, all white men with university degrees in agronomy, would visit his farm and offer advice that revealed they fundamentally misunderstood the land he was working. They recommended drainage spacing appropriate for sandy loam when his soil was heavy clay. They suggested crops that required dry conditions for land that stayed saturated half the year. When Morrison politely explained why their recommendations wouldn't work, they often responded with condescension or irritation, as if a black farmer challenging their expertise represented either ignorance or insubordination. Yet Morrison's farm consistently outproduced neighboring properties, including some owned by white farmers working supposedly superior land. His cotton yields per acre exceeded county averages by 15 to 20% most years. His corn prospered in conditions that left neighbors' crops stunted. Other black farmers in the region would visit, seeking advice about managing difficult soil, and Morrison would share his knowledge freely, teaching them to read their land the way he read his. By 1943, when Morrison was 61 years old, he had accumulated more than 4 decades of intensive experience managing challenging agricultural land. He understood soil mechanics, hydrology, drainage engineering, and crop science at a level that rivaled university-trained agronomists, though his knowledge came from practice rather than formal education. When the United States Army began recruiting agricultural specialists to support operations in Europe, someone in the War Department had the insight to recognize that farmers with experience managing difficult land might prove valuable for maintaining supply lines through European farming regions that had been devastated by years of conflict. Morrison enlisted in the Army Corps of Engineers Agricultural Unit in January 1944, part of a cohort of older men whose farming expertise made them more valuable than their age might suggest. The unit's official purpose was agricultural reconstruction, helping to restore productivity to European farmland, advising on crop rotation and soil management, supporting the logistics of feeding both military forces and civilian populations. The idea that this agricultural knowledge might have direct tactical applications apparently occurred to no one during the recruitment and training process. Morrison arrived in Belgium 3 months before the Ardennes incident, assigned to a sector responsible for maintaining supply route integrity through farming regions. His commanding officer, Captain Robert Henderson, 28 years old and a recent graduate of West Point with a degree in civil engineering, initially regarded Morrison's unit with barely concealed skepticism. Henderson came from Connecticut wealth, old money that had insulated his family from the Depression, funded his private school education, and ensured his path to military academy. His exposure to farming consisted primarily of visiting the manicured estate gardens that his family's groundskeepers maintained. When Morrison first proposed his plan for defending the sector, Henderson's response had been dismissive to the point of mockery. The meeting took place in Henderson's temporary headquarters, a requisitioned farmhouse whose Belgian owners had fled weeks earlier, leaving behind furniture that now supported maps, communication equipment, and the administrative apparatus of a military unit operating in occupied territory. Maps covered every available wall surface, marked with colored pins indicating friendly forces, known enemy positions, supply routes, and defensive preparations. Morrison entered the headquarters carrying hand-drawn diagrams and soil samples collected during his survey of the sector. He had spent 3 days walking the area, using a simple probe, nothing more than a metal rod marked with measurement gradations, to test soil composition and resistance at hundreds of points. The resulting data, carefully recorded in a notebook that Morrison carried everywhere, showed patterns that standard military reconnaissance had completely missed. "Captain Henderson, sir," Morrison began, standing at attention despite being old enough to be Henderson's father, "I've completed my survey of the sector's soil conditions and identified several features that might be tactically significant." Henderson barely glanced up from the operations map he was studying. "Morrison, I appreciate your thoroughness, but unless the soil conditions involve concealed enemy positions or unexpected obstacles, I'm not sure they qualify as tactically significant. We're preparing defensive positions against a potential German advance, not planning a harvest." The casual dismissal might have discouraged someone less experienced with being underestimated, but Morrison had spent 40 years having his expertise questioned. He continued patiently, "Sir, with respect, soil conditions determine what terrain can support heavy vehicles and what terrain cannot. The road running through this sector passes between two areas with very different load-bearing characteristics. If we create circumstances that encourage enemy vehicles to leave the road at specific points, we can effectively immobilize them without expending ammunition or requiring direct engagement. This at least captured Henderson's attention. The young captain looked up from his map, expression skeptical but curious. "Explain." Morrison unrolled his hand-drawn diagram on the nearest table, displacing several official topographical maps in the process. His sketch showed the road, the surrounding terrain, and annotations marking soil types, drainage patterns, and load-bearing estimates. The area north of the road is genuine farmland, topsoil over compacted clay over limestone bedrock. It can support heavy vehicles indefinitely. But the area to the south only appears stable. It's actually a false meadow sitting atop 3 to 5 meters of saturated peat. The peat looks solid because it has a grass layer on top and appears similar to the genuine farmland. But introduce heavy weight, especially distributed across multiple points, and the peat will behave like liquid rather than solid ground. Henderson studied the diagram, frowning. "Peat? You're saying there's a hidden swamp adjacent to the road?" "Not a swamp exactly, sir. The water is integrated into the organic matrix rather than sitting on the surface. But functionally, yes, it's ground that cannot support heavy vehicles, disguised to look like ground that can. The key point is that German forces, if they encounter obstacles on the road, will instinctively maneuver around them. If we position those obstacles correctly, we can channel them onto the false meadow without them realizing the danger until it's too late." "And your proposed obstacles are what exactly? Anti-tank barriers? Cratered sections of road?" "Rope, sir. Simple hemp rope barriers positioned across the road at strategic intervals." The silence that followed this pronouncement was profound. Henderson stared at Morrison as if the older man had suggested defending the sector with harsh language and pointed sticks. Finally, he spoke, his tone carefully controlled. "Let me understand this correctly, Morrison. You want to defend a 2-kilometer stretch of road against German armor using rope? Not barbed wire, not anti-tank obstacles, not mines. Rope." Morrison had anticipated this reaction. "Yes, sir, 1/4-inch hemp rope, to be specific. The kind we use for securing cargo. The rope itself isn't the defensive mechanism. It's a psychological tool that exploits standard German tactical doctrine. Their training emphasizes speed and formation integrity. When they encounter an obstacle that appears minor, like a rope barrier, doctrine says to go around it quickly, rather than stopping to deal with it directly. If we position the barriers correctly, their natural response will be to maneuver onto the false meadow while maintaining speed and formation. You're proposing to trick them into driving into soft ground. I'm proposing to create conditions where their own tactical training leads them to make decisions that appear reasonable, but that will result in vehicle immobilization. It's not deception so much as understanding how they think and creating circumstances that exploit that understanding." Henderson walked to the window, looking out at the countryside that formed the sector he was responsible for defending. From this vantage point, the terrain looked peaceful, rolling farmland, a road running through it, nothing particularly remarkable. The idea that this ordinary landscape could be transformed into a trap, using nothing but rope and knowledge of soil composition, seemed, to his engineer-trained mind, simultaneously brilliant and absurd. "Morrison," he said finally, not turning from the window, "I graduated from West Point with honors. I studied military engineering under some of the finest instructors in the United States Army. I know how to design fortifications, emplace obstacles, calculate fields of fire. What you're describing doesn't appear in any engineering manual I've ever read." "No, sir, it wouldn't. It appears in farming knowledge that most engineers don't have access to. Farmers who work difficult land spend decades learning to read soil, understand drainage, predict how ground will behave under stress. That knowledge has agricultural applications, but it also has tactical applications if someone recognizes the connection." Henderson turned back to face Morrison. "And if you're wrong, if the peat doesn't behave the way you predict, or if German commanders don't respond the way you expect, or if any of a dozen other variables prove different than your assumptions, we will have wasted time and resources on rope barriers that accomplish nothing. "That's absolutely possible, sir," Morrison acknowledged, "but the resource investment is minimal. Perhaps $200 worth of rope and 5 days of labor from my unit. The potential payoff, if it works as I predict, is eliminating or immobilizing enemy vehicles without firing a shot, without expending scarce ammunition, and without risking American lives in direct engagement. Even if there's only a 20% chance of success, the cost-benefit analysis seems favorable." What Henderson didn't say, but what Morrison understood from the captain's expression, was that Morrison's race factored into the calculation. A white agricultural consultant with university credentials making this proposal might have received immediate authorization. Morrison, a black farmer with no formal education beyond elementary school, faced skepticism amplified by assumptions about who could possess sophisticated tactical insight. Henderson wasn't deliberately racist, he likely would have described himself as egalitarian, but unconscious bias shaped his initial dismissal of Morrison's expertise. The eventual authorization came less from confidence in the plan and more from pragmatic calculation. The sector was low priority. Resources were scarce, and conventional defensive preparations were already in place. If Morrison wanted to experiment with rope barriers, it would cost almost nothing and might, through some miracle, actually accomplish something. Henderson's subsequent report to division headquarters made his skepticism clear, describing the rope barrier plan as an unconventional approach proposed by agricultural support personnel, authorized on a provisional basis given minimal resource requirements and low strategic importance of the sector. Morrison accepted the conditional authorization without comment on the condescension embedded in its phrasing. He had secured permission to proceed, which was what mattered. Whether Henderson believed in the plan or dismissed it as a harmless diversion was ultimately irrelevant if the plan worked. What Henderson failed to understand, despite his engineering degree, was that the Ardennes terrain was anything but simple. The region's geology created a complex relationship between surface appearance and subsurface reality. Millennia of glacial activity had deposited layers of clay, sand, and organic material in patterns that made certain areas stable, while leaving others deceptively fragile. Morrison, who had spent his career reading soil the way scholars read ancient texts, had recognized something during his initial survey of the sector that no military engineer had noticed. The road the German convoy would inevitably use ran directly between two zones of radically different load-bearing capacity. To the north of the road lay genuine farmland, compacted soil over limestone bedrock, capable of supporting heavy vehicles indefinitely. To the south, however, lay what Morrison identified as a false meadow, a landscape that appeared solid but sat atop a layer of saturated peat measuring between 3 and 5 meters deep. The peat itself rested on impermeable clay, creating essentially a massive sponge that happened to have grass growing on its surface. During dry conditions, the peat could support a man's weight, even a small vehicle. But introduce the right amount of water, apply the right kind of pressure, and the entire area would transform into a quagmire capable of swallowing vehicles whole. Morrison's plan was elegant in its simplicity, though explaining it to skeptical officers proved challenging. He would use rope, specifically the 1/4-inch hemp rope used for securing cargo, to create a series of guide barriers along the road. These barriers would serve two purposes. First, they would psychologically channel German vehicles into predictable paths by creating the appearance of obstacles they would want to avoid. Second, and more importantly, the rope barriers themselves would be anchored to posts driven deep into the false meadow, with the installation process deliberately disturbing the peat layer's equilibrium. "You're going to make them drive into a swamp using rope as bait?" Henderson had asked, his tone suggesting he thought Morrison had lost his mind. "Not exactly bait, sir. More like gentle persuasion. German tactical doctrine emphasizes speed and maintaining formation. When their lead vehicles encounter what appears to be a rope barrier across the road, nothing that looks particularly dangerous, just inconvenient, their training says to go around it, maintain momentum, keep the convoy moving. They'll choose the path that looks most stable, which will be the south side toward the meadow. And if they just cut through the rope? Then they cut through the rope, sir, and we've lost maybe 50 meters of hemp. But if they're moving at speed, trying to maintain formation integrity, dealing with poor visibility, and operating in enemy territory where every decision carries risk. They'll take the path of least resistance. That's what their doctrine demands. Henderson had authorized Morrison to proceed, though his subsequent reports to division headquarters made clear he expected nothing to come of it. The authorization came less from confidence in Morrison's plan and more from the simple reality that the sector was considered low priority. Resources were scarce, and if an old farmer wanted to spend his time playing with rope, it cost the army nothing. Morrison spent 5 days implementing his system, working with a crew of 8 men from his agricultural unit. They began by carefully mapping the exact boundaries between stable ground and the false meadow, using simple probes and their collective experience reading soil resistance. Then they installed a series of rope barriers at intervals along the road, each barrier consisting of 1/4-inch hemp rope strung between posts at approximately waist height, high enough to be clearly visible, low enough to seem easily circumvented. The critical detail, invisible to anyone who didn't understand soil mechanics, was how they installed the anchor posts on the south side of the road. Each post penetrated through the grass layer and the upper peat, driven down until it reached the saturated lower peat. The installation process itself, requiring heavy hammering and the displacement of material, created channels that allowed water to migrate more freely through the peat matrix. Over the course of 5 days, as December rain fell steadily, these channels acted like capillary networks, distributing moisture throughout the peat layer and reducing its bearing capacity from marginal to catastrophic. Morrison also implemented what he called auxiliary drainage modifications, a euphemism for deliberately blocking several natural drainage channels that normally carried water away from the meadow. Using nothing more sophisticated than strategically placed earth berms and diverted streams, he ensured that water accumulated in the peat rather than flowing away. By December 15th, the false meadow looked exactly as it had 2 weeks earlier, a peaceful expanse of winter grass, perhaps slightly damp but certainly not swamp-like. Beneath the surface, however, the peat had transformed into a saturated gel with the consistency of half-set concrete and approximately the same load-bearing capacity as pudding. When Hauptmann Werner's convoy entered the sector at 0800 hours on December 15th, everything proceeded exactly as Morrison had predicted. The German reconnaissance scouts, motorcycles with sidecars, encountered the first rope barrier approximately 1 kilometer into the sector. The barrier stretched across the entire road, tied between posts on either side, looking for all the world like something a farmer might have erected to keep livestock contained. Werner's lead scout Feldwebel Klaus Hoffmann radioed back to the convoy. His report, later recovered from German communication logs, demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking that Morrison had anticipated. Rope obstacle at coordinates 479-236. Recommend flanking south. Terrain appears stable. Minimal delay anticipated. Werner approved the maneuver without hesitation. Speed was essential. The convoy carried supplies desperately needed by forward units, and every minute spent stationary in potentially hostile territory increased vulnerability. The scouts went around the barrier, their light motorcycles handling the slight detour with ease. The grass barely showed their tracks. When the first half-track followed, weighing approximately 8,000 kilograms fully loaded, the surface initially held. The vehicle's tracks, designed for cross-country mobility, distributed weight across a wide area. For the first 10 meters, everything seemed fine. Then the peat began to respond. The driver, Obergefreiter Hans Müller, felt it first, a subtle change in resistance, as if the ground had suddenly become less solid. He increased throttle standard procedure when encountering soft ground, trying to maintain momentum. The half-track surged forward, but instead of crossing the soft patch, it began to settle. The tracks, which had been distributing weight across the surface, now served as anchors, their cleats biting into the peat and creating suction. Müller's panicked radio call captured the moment. Ground giving way. Requesting. The transmission ended as electrical systems shorted when water flooded the engine compartment. The half-track, weighing 8,000 kilograms, had sunk to its chassis in less than 40 seconds. Müller and his crew scrambled out, standing in grass-covered peat that now rippled like liquid beneath their boots. Werner, observing from his command vehicle still on the road, made a decision that would doom the entire convoy. Seeing one vehicle stuck, he assumed a localized soft spot, perhaps an old well or drainage ditch hidden beneath the vegetation. He ordered the convoy to spread out, with vehicles taking different paths around both the rope barrier and the stuck half-track, distributing the advance across a wider front to avoid concentrating weight in any single area. It was precisely the wrong decision, and exactly what Morrison had hoped for. As 17 half-tracks and 9 supply trucks fanned out, each seeking the path that looked most stable, they distributed their combined weight across the entire false meadow. The peat, already saturated to its maximum capacity, responded to the cumulative stress like a liquid rather than a solid. Load-bearing capacity, already minimal, collapsed entirely. What happened next looked, to observers on the road, like the earth itself was swallowing the convoy. Half-tracks weighing 8,000 kilograms sank within minutes, often settling so quickly that crews had barely enough time to evacuate. Supply trucks, heavier and with less surface area in contact with the ground, performed even worse. Several dropped so rapidly that equipment inside shifted, crushing cargo and making escape through rear doors nearly impossible. Private First Class Robert Chen, an American forward observer positioned 800 meters away with a radio and binoculars, provided real-time reports that became the primary Allied documentation of the incident. His transmissions, later transcribed from Signal Corps recordings, captured the surreal quality of watching modern military vehicles simply disappear. 0820 hours. German convoy has halted. Multiple vehicles appear stuck. 0822. Additional vehicles maneuvering off-road attempting to bypass. 0826. Vehicles sinking, repeat, sinking into terrain. Estimate 4 vehicles now immobilized. 0831. Cannot get accurate count. Visibility poor, but at least 10 vehicles appear stuck or sinking. Germans attempting recovery operations. 0845. I've never seen anything like this. Vehicles are just going down. The earth looks solid, but they're sinking like it's water. Werner, watching his convoy disintegrate, initially attempted standard recovery procedures. The armored reconnaissance vehicles, still on the road and thus on stable ground, tried to winch out the stuck half-tracks using their recovery cables. The first attempt pulled the recovery vehicle forward off the road rather than extracting the half-track. The second attempt snapped a cable rated for 5,000 kilograms of pull when the stuck vehicle refused to budge. The suction created by peat surrounding the tracks exceeded the cable's braking strength. By 0900 hours, Werner faced a situation that military training had not prepared him for. 17 half-tracks and 9 supply trucks, representing millions of Reichsmarks worth of equipment and supplies critical to the offensive, were stuck in what appeared to be ordinary farmland. More troubling, several vehicles had sunk deep enough that only their upper structures remained visible, and the sinking showed no signs of stopping. Attempting to walk across the meadow to reach vehicles proved dangerous. Soldiers found themselves waist-deep in saturated peat, requiring rescue themselves. Werner's decision, at 0915 hours, demonstrated both his courage and his fundamental misunderstanding of what he faced. Unable to accept that vehicles could simply disappear into earth that looked solid, he concluded that the convoy had stumbled into a deliberately prepared trap, perhaps a camouflaged marsh or a field that had been artificially flooded. He ordered his remaining mobile vehicles to withdraw to the road and called for engineer support to drain the swamp and recover the trapped equipment. The engineer platoon that arrived at 1100 hours, led by Lieutenant Otto Schneider, approached the problem with German efficiency and thoroughness. Schneider, a civil engineer in civilian life, understood hydraulics and drainage. His plan was methodical: establish pumping stations at the meadow's lowest points, dig drainage channels to carry away water, use timber mats to create stable platforms for recovery vehicles, and systematically extract each stuck vehicle. What Schneider didn't understand, because his engineering training focused on built environments rather than natural systems, was that he was attempting to drain not a conventional swamp, but a 3 to 5 meter deep layer of saturated peat sitting on impermeable clay. The water wasn't standing on top of the ground where it could be pumped away. It was integrated into the peat matrix itself, held in place by organic material that had spent thousands of years accumulating. Draining it would require either evaporation or physically removing the peat itself, processes that would take weeks or months, not hours. The German engineers worked through December 15th and into December 16th, achieving precisely nothing. Pumps ran continuously, moving water from drainage channels they dug, but the meadow's saturation level never changed. Timber mats, intended to create stable platforms, simply sank into the peat under their own weight. Attempts to dig drainage channels deeper encountered the clay layer and succeeded only in creating routes for water to flow into the meadow from surrounding higher ground. Meanwhile, the stuck vehicles continued their inexorable descent. By the evening of December 15th, 3 half-tracks had sunk deep enough that only their roof structures remained visible. By the morning of December 16th, 2 of those had disappeared entirely, marked only by disturbed grass and the occasional bubble rising through standing water that had accumulated in the depressions their sinking created. Morrison, receiving reports from forward observers, experienced a combination of satisfaction and unease. The technical success exceeded his predictions. The peat had performed exactly as his soil analysis suggested it would, but watching equipment worth millions of dollars sink into the earth, seeing soldiers struggle in waist-deep peat trying to save their vehicles, left him troubled. War was war, and disabled German equipment meant fewer threats to Allied soldiers, but there was something disturbing about the impersonal efficiency of the trap. No explosions, no gunfire, just earth and water doing what earth and water did when humans failed to understand them. Captain Henderson, reviewing the same observer reports, experienced a rather different emotion. His initial skepticism about Morrison's plan had transformed into something between amazement and professional embarrassment. The rope barriers, which Henderson had authorized mainly because they seemed harmless, had eliminated an entire German convoy without firing a shot, without expending any scarce ammunition or explosives, using nothing but local materials and knowledge that any experienced farmer could have provided. Henderson visited Morrison's position on the evening of December 16th, ostensibly to review defensive positions, but actually to offer something approaching an apology. He found Morrison supervising the installation of additional rope barriers farther down the road, preparing for the possibility that German commanders might send another convoy attempting a different route. "Morrison," Henderson said, watching the older man direct his crew with quiet authority, "I owe you an acknowledgement. What you accomplished, what your plan accomplished, it's remarkable. Division headquarters is calling it the most cost-effective defensive success of the month." Morrison paused in his work, wiping mud from his hands. "Appreciate that, sir, though I'd note that calling it cost-effective might miss the point. Those German soldiers out there in the meadow, they're not having a cost-effective experience. They're cold, they're scared, and they're watching their equipment sink into the earth while they can't do anything about it. That's not something I take pleasure in. But it is something you designed to happen. Yes, sir, it is. War creates strange necessities. In Mississippi, I spent 40 years trying to keep water away from where it could do damage, trying to stabilize soil, make things grow. Here I'm using the same knowledge to do the opposite. Same principles, different purpose. Doesn't mean I have to like it." The conversation was interrupted by a radio call from Chen, the forward observer. The Germans were abandoning the recovery effort. After 36 hours of continuous work, having achieved nothing but exhausting their engineer platoon and expending fuel for pumps that accomplished no useful work, Werner had accepted the inevitable. The convoy was lost. Intelligence reports suggested he had been ordered to destroy any equipment that might be salvageable and withdraw. Over the following week, Morrison's sector became a minor tourist attraction for Allied officers who wanted to see the famous disappearing convoy. They arrived expecting to see wrecked vehicles, perhaps burned or blown up, and instead found a peaceful winter meadow with a few odd protrusions, antenna masts, the tops of canvas covers, occasional glimpses of metal beneath disturbed grass. The vehicles hadn't been destroyed in any conventional sense. They had simply sunk into the earth, claimed by geology and hydrology that predated human conflict by millennia. One visitor, a colonel from the Army Corps of Engineers headquarters, spent an entire afternoon walking the site with Morrison, taking notes and soil samples. Colonel William Barrett, a geologist before the war, understood immediately what Morrison had accomplished and recognized its broader implications. "Morrison, what you've demonstrated here has applications far beyond this single incident," Barrett said, crouching beside one of the anchor posts and examining how water had migrated through the disturbed peat. "We're planning to cross the Rhine eventually, which means dealing with European river valleys and their associated wetlands. How many men in your agricultural unit have this kind of expertise?" "Most of them, sir, to varying degrees. We've got farmers from Louisiana who understand delta soil, men from the Carolinas who know coastal marshes, fellows from the Midwest who can read prairie hydrology. Every region has its own soil signatures, and anyone who's farmed difficult land for decades develops an understanding that goes beyond what you can learn from textbooks. Why wasn't this expertise integrated into planning earlier?" Morrison's expression suggested the question answered itself. "Well, sir, I'd speculate that when the Army Corps of Engineers was recruiting specialists, they were looking for men with engineering degrees and military academy credentials. The idea that a 62-year-old black farmer from Mississippi might know something useful about European soil probably didn't occur to anyone. We're here because somebody needed agricultural advisors to help manage supply line logistics through farming regions. Using that knowledge for tactical purposes was an improvisation, not part of any plan." Barrett nodded slowly, understanding the implications. "That's going to change. I'm recommending to headquarters that agricultural specialists be integrated into reconnaissance and engineering planning for all future operations. What you've demonstrated, using natural terrain characteristics as defensive weapons, it's not just clever, it's a fundamental rethinking of how we approach defensive operations." The recommendation went up the chain of command, accompanied by detailed reports on the Ardennes incident. Within 6 weeks, Morrison found himself reassigned to SHAEF Headquarters, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, as a consultant on terrain analysis. His responsibilities expanded from managing a single sector to reviewing invasion plans for the Rhine crossing. Analyzing topographical surveys of terrain Allied forces would encounter deeper into Germany, and training engineer units in what became officially designated as agricultural terrain assessment. The transformation from farmer to military consultant was surreal for Morrison. He attended planning meetings where generals studied maps and discussed strategy, offering observations about soil composition and hydrology that sometimes contradicted what conventional military intelligence suggested. Some officers accepted his input enthusiastically. Others regarded him with the same skepticism Henderson had initially shown. One particular planning session in February 1945 demonstrated both the value and the challenges of Morrison's position. Allied forces were planning crossings of the Roer River, with engineer units tasked to establish bridges and maintain supply routes through river valleys that German forces had deliberately flooded. The conventional engineering assessment suggested draining the floods, pumping out water, and building temporary roadways across the exposed riverbed. Morrison studied the topographical surveys and hydraulic reports for 3 days before submitting his analysis. His conclusion was stark. Attempting to drain the flooded valleys would require weeks and accomplish little, because the Germans had demolished upstream dams, creating sustained high water that would immediately refill any area that was pumped out. Instead, Morrison recommended accepting the flooding as a new baseline and building logistics around it, using amphibious vehicles and floating roadways rather than trying to restore dry land. The debate in the planning session was heated. One engineer major, who had spent considerable time calculating pump capacity and drainage timelines, regarded Morrison's recommendation as defeatist. "We're just going to accept that the Germans can flood terrain and make it impassable. That's letting them dictate our logistics." Morrison, the only enlisted man in a room full of officers, chose his words carefully. "Sir, I'm suggesting we recognize the difference between what we want the terrain to be and what it actually is. The Germans didn't create the water, they just released it from dams that were already there. The valleys are flooded because that's their natural state when the dams aren't holding water back. We can spend 3 weeks pumping, or we can spend 3 days adapting our logistics to work with the water instead of against it. One approach fights nature, the other one uses it. The floating roadway approach was ultimately adopted, saving an estimated 2 to 3 weeks compared to the drainage plan, and proving more reliable because it didn't depend on maintaining pumps in combat conditions. Morrison's recommendation, initially controversial, became another case study in how understanding natural systems could provide military advantages. By March 1945, Morrison had participated in planning for 17 different operations, trained 43 engineer officers in agricultural terrain assessment, and written what became the Army Corps of Engineers' first field manual on soil analysis for military applications. The manual, officially titled Terrain Assessment Using Agricultural Methodologies, was colloquially known as Morrison's Mud Manual and remained in use for decades after the war. The irony wasn't lost on Morrison. He had spent his entire adult life fighting for recognition as a competent farmer in Mississippi, dealing with county agricultural agents who questioned whether a black man could really understand soil science, navigating a system that assumed his success was either luck or the result of following white farmers' guidance. Now at 63, he was writing official Army doctrine and training officers who had engineering degrees from prestigious universities. The original Convoy, meanwhile, achieved a kind of immortality in both German and Allied military records, though the two sides remembered it quite differently. German after-action reports classified it as losses due to unforeseen terrain conditions, filing it alongside other incidents where equipment was lost to non-combat causes. The psychological impact on German commanders, however, was more significant than the material losses. The incident reinforced a growing sense that Allied forces possessed comprehensive intelligence about European terrain, that nowhere was truly safe, that even ordinary-looking farmland might conceal sophisticated traps. This psychological effect was precisely what Allied intelligence had hoped for. While Morrison's original intention had been purely tactical, stop this specific convoy in this specific sector, the strategic implications of demonstrating that terrain itself could be weaponized proved valuable. German forces became more cautious, spent more time on reconnaissance, delayed movements while engineers assessed ground conditions. The cumulative effect of these delays, multiplied across dozens of sectors, measurably slowed German logistics during the critical final months of the war. One unexpected consequence emerged in May 1945, shortly after Germany's surrender. Allied intelligence officers, processing captured German documents, discovered references to the Ardennes terrain trap in multiple reports from different units. German intelligence had concluded that the incident resulted from sophisticated Allied engineering, specialized equipment that could undermine ground stability, perhaps chemicals that altered soil composition, or carefully camouflaged excavation that created hidden voids. The possibility that the trap had been created by an elderly farmer using rope and knowledge of soil hydrology apparently never occurred to them. The captured documents revealed something else interesting. German engineers had attempted to replicate the technique, assuming they understood the principle. Several incidents during February and March 1945 involved German forces attempting to create similar traps for advancing Allied units, with universally poor results. The attempts failed because German engineers focused on the visible elements, rope barriers and surface appearance, without understanding the underlying soil mechanics. Creating a false meadow required very specific geological conditions and weeks of careful preparation to alter subsurface hydrology. It couldn't be improvised or deployed in arbitrary locations. Morrison found this both amusing and sobering. Amusing because it confirmed that sophisticated training and engineering degrees were no substitute for practical knowledge earned through decades of experience. Sobering because it meant men had likely been killed in failed attempts to replicate a defensive technique they fundamentally misunderstood. After the war ended, Morrison faced a decision that mirrored one confronting millions of veterans: what to do next. The Army offered him a permanent civilian position as a consultant with the Corps of Engineers, good salary, benefits, interesting work. It would mean staying in Europe or relocating to Washington, D.C., continuing the work he had been doing, training new generations of engineers in principles of terrain analysis. He declined. In June 1945, Morrison returned to Mississippi, to the farm he had left 16 months earlier, to land that neighbors had maintained in his absence. His explanation, offered to Colonel Barrett, who had become both a colleague and friend, was characteristically straightforward. "I appreciate the offer, sir, truly, but I'm a farmer. I spent 40 years learning to read Mississippi soil, understanding how water moves through delta clay, knowing when to plant based on 100 subtle signs most people never notice. That knowledge served the Army well, and I'm proud of that service. But my work is growing things, not helping to plan military operations. The war's over. Time to go home." Barrett understood, though he noted that Morrison's expertise would be difficult to replace. The recommendation that agricultural specialists be integrated into military planning had been accepted at the highest levels, but finding individuals with Morrison's combination of practical knowledge, analytical ability, and capacity to translate rural expertise into military applications proved challenging. Morrison was, in many respects, unique, a product of specific circumstances that had forced him to develop sophisticated understanding while simultaneously being denied formal recognition for that understanding. Morrison's return to Mississippi was complicated by the same racial dynamics that had defined his pre-war life. The farm he returned to was the same one he had left, but he was not the same man. He had spent 16 months being treated, however imperfectly, as a valued expert whose knowledge had strategic importance. He had trained officers, influenced planning, written official doctrine. Returning to a social system that regarded him as inherently inferior, simply because of his race, created a cognitive dissonance that many black veterans experienced. The local county agricultural agent, a white man named Thomas Wilkins, who had questioned Morrison's farming methods for years before the war, visited the farm 2 weeks after Morrison's return. Wilkins had heard, through informal channels, that Morrison had done something notable in the Army, though details were vague. His visit was ostensibly about standard agricultural extension services, but actually driven by curiosity. "Welcome back, Morrison," Wilkins said, finding the older man inspecting drainage ditches that had been maintained but not improved during his absence. "Heard you were somewhere in Europe. Army have you doing farm work over there?" Morrison considered how to answer. The full truth, that he had eliminated a German convoy using soil mechanics, trained Army engineers, written military doctrine, would sound like boasting or fantasy. "Soil analysis mostly," he said, which was technically accurate. "European terrain is different from what we have here, but the principles are similar. Water's still water, clay's still clay." "Soil analysis," Wilkins repeated, his tone suggesting skepticism that the Army would need a black farmer for such work. "Well, good to have you back. I trust you won't have picked up any fancy European ideas about farming. Mississippi soil needs Mississippi methods." The condescension was familiar, even comforting in its predictability. Morrison nodded politely and returned to examining his drainage system, calculating how the ditches could be improved to handle the heavy rains that came every spring. He didn't mention that he had recently reviewed engineering plans for managing river valleys in Germany, or that his Mississippi methods had proven applicable to terrain thousands of miles away. Over the following years, Morrison continued farming with quiet competence, improving his yields through careful attention to drainage, crop rotation, and soil management. He occasionally received letters from Barrett or other Army contacts, updating him on how his techniques were being applied in various contexts, thanking him for his contributions. He answered politely but briefly, emphasizing that his work now focused entirely on farming. The rope barriers that had started everything, those simple quarter-inch hemp lines that had channeled a German convoy to its doom, became something of a personal joke. Morrison used similar rope barriers on his farm, strung between posts to mark field boundaries and guide livestock. Visitors who knew nothing of his war service would see them and think nothing of it, just another farmer using basic equipment. Morrison found satisfaction in that anonymity. The most effective defensive tactic he had employed had been, at its core, ordinary farming knowledge applied to military purposes. Now he was applying the same knowledge to its intended purpose, growing food. In 1952, Morrison received an unexpected visitor, a young lieutenant from the Army Corps of Engineers, recently assigned to a project examining soil stability for military installations. had been reviewing historical files and encountered Morrison's manual. Impressed by the content and curious about the author, he had traced Morrison to Mississippi and requested permission to visit. Morrison agreed, more out of courtesy than enthusiasm. The lieutenant, whose name was David Park, arrived expecting to meet a retired military consultant, perhaps a former officer or civilian engineer. Finding instead an elderly farmer in work clothes, living in a modest farmhouse on land that clearly required constant attention, created obvious confusion. "Mr. Morrison? I'm looking for Samuel Morrison, the author of the Corps of Engineers Terrain Assessment Manual." "That's me," Morrison confirmed, wiping soil from his hands. "Though I should clarify that I'm a farmer who spent some time consulting for the Army, not the other way around. The manual was just writing down what any experienced farmer could tell you about reading soil and water." Park spent the afternoon asking questions about soil mechanics, hydraulic systems, and the principles underlying the manual's recommendations. Morrison answered patiently, often walking Park through his fields to demonstrate concepts using the land itself as illustration, how water moved through different soil layers, how plant growth indicated subsurface conditions, how seasonal changes affected load-bearing capacity, all the knowledge that had made the Ardennes trap possible and that continued to guide Morrison's farming decisions. "Sir," Park said as he prepared to leave, "I want you to understand that the manual you wrote has become foundational text for military engineering. Officers study it at West Point. It's referenced in planning for installations worldwide. Your work has had enormous impact." Morrison appreciated the recognition but deflected the praise. "Lieutenant, I appreciate you saying that, but I'd suggest the impact belongs to the knowledge, not to me personally. Every experienced farmer knows these things, or variations of them appropriate to their region. What happened during the war was simply that circumstances forced the Army to pay attention to knowledge that had always been available. The real lesson isn't about me. It's about recognizing expertise wherever it exists, regardless of whether it comes with formal credentials." After Park departed, Morrison returned to work on a drainage project that had been occupying his attention for weeks. The principle was identical to what he had applied in Belgium, understanding subsurface water movement and creating conditions that directed flow where he wanted it, rather than where gravity alone would take it. The purpose was different, growing cotton instead of stopping military convoys, but the knowledge was the same. The full story of the Ardennes incident gradually became public through military histories published in the 1950s and 60s. Morrison's role was usually mentioned briefly, if at all. Most accounts focused on the tactical outcome rather than the individual responsible. The few histories that did acknowledge Morrison's contribution tended to frame it as an amusing anecdote. Clever farmer tricks German convoy. The sophisticated understanding of soil mechanics, the detailed analysis of terrain, the weeks of preparation that made the trap possible, often got lost in narratives that preferred simple stories to complex ones. Morrison never sought to correct these accounts or claim greater recognition. His perspective, shaped by decades of being simultaneously indispensable and invisible in Mississippi's agricultural economy, was that the work mattered more than credit for it. The German convoy had been stopped, Allied operations had benefited from improved terrain analysis, and military engineering had integrated agricultural expertise into its practices. Whether historians properly attributed these outcomes to their sources seemed to Morrison largely irrelevant. In 1968, the year Morrison turned 86, he received a letter from the Department of the Army notifying him that his wartime contributions were being formally recognized with a commendation and an invitation to a ceremony in Washington. Morrison declined the invitation, citing his age and the difficulty of travel, but accepted the commendation gracefully. The certificate, signed by the Secretary of the Army, and describing his innovative application of agricultural expertise to military engineering challenges, was framed and hung in his farmhouse, visible to visitors but uncommented upon by Morrison himself. He continued farming with assistance from family members until his death in 1971 at the age of 89. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service in a single sentence, focusing primarily on his decades of community involvement and success as a farmer. The land he had worked for nearly 50 years was inherited by his son, who continued farming it, using the same careful attention to drainage and soil management that Morrison had demonstrated throughout his life. The Ardennes site itself underwent several transformations after the war. The false meadow, having served its purpose, gradually dried out over successive summers as the deliberate drainage obstructions Morrison had created eroded away. Several of the sunken vehicles were eventually recovered in the 1950s during agricultural reclamation projects, emerging from the peat encrusted with mud and largely intact but completely inoperable. They were scrapped for metal, with their recovery making brief local news but generating little broader interest. One half-track, too deep for practical recovery, remains there still approximately 4 meters below the surface, a steel monument to the day when an elderly farmer's understanding of soil proved more powerful than military engineering. Local farmers, working the land that has long since returned to agricultural use, occasionally encounter odd resistance when ploughing, metal fragments near the surface, or depressions that fill with water more quickly than surrounding areas. Most don't know why. The land remembers, even if human memory has moved on. The rope barriers, those simple hemp lines that started everything, decayed within months of the war's end, returning to the earth as organic matter. The posts that held them lasted longer, eventually removed by farmers reclaiming land for cultivation. No physical trace of Morrison's defensive system remains visible, which seems appropriate. The most effective trap he designed left no evidence of being a trap at all. Just earth and water behaving as earth and water naturally behave when humans understand their properties. The broader lesson of Morrison's contribution took decades to fully integrate into military thinking. The idea that local expertise, often held by individuals without formal credentials or institutional recognition, might provide capabilities that conventional training overlooks, proved challenging for hierarchical organizations to accept. Morrison's success demonstrated the principle, but implementing it systematically required cultural changes that came slowly. Modern military doctrine does incorporate terrain analysis methodologies that trace directly to Morrison's manual, though the connection is often obscured by layers of subsequent revision and elaboration. Officers study soil mechanics, hydrology, and environmental factors as part of standard engineering training, often without knowing that these subjects entered military education because an elderly farmer demonstrated their tactical relevance in a Belgian meadow in 1944. What Morrison accomplished with rope and soil knowledge, spending perhaps $200 on materials and investing 5 days of labor, eliminated equipment worth millions of dollars and delayed German operations for weeks. The cost-effectiveness is striking, but focusing solely on the economic calculation misses something essential. Morrison's success wasn't about finding a cheap alternative to expensive weapons. It was about understanding systems, ecological, hydrological, geological, deeply enough to work with them rather than against them. The German convoy disappeared not because Morrison overcame nature, but because he understood it and created conditions where natural processes did the work. The peat that swallowed the vehicles had existed for thousands of years before the war. The water that saturated it fell from clouds following meteorological patterns operating on continental scales. Morrison didn't create these forces. He simply understood them well enough to direct their effects toward a specific purpose. This distinction matters because it highlights a different conception of power. Conventional military power typically involves overcoming resistance through superior force, more armor, bigger guns, heavier bombardment. Morrison's approach involved understanding systems so thoroughly that resistance becomes unnecessary. The peat didn't resist the vehicles. It simply responded to their weight according to physical laws governing saturated organic soil. No force required, just knowledge and patience. That 62-year-old black farmer from Mississippi possessed this knowledge and successfully applied it to military purposes, while decorated officers with engineering degrees initially dismissed his expertise, reflects uncomfortable truths about how societies recognize and value knowledge. Morrison spent 40 years developing sophisticated understanding of soil mechanics because his livelihood depended on it. Farming marginal land requires deeper expertise than farming rich soil. Yet that expertise was invisible to institutions designed to identify and credential capability. The war created a temporary gap in these institutional barriers, a moment when desperate need for practical results overcame conventional assumptions about who possessed valuable knowledge. Morrison walked through that gap, demonstrated capabilities that changed military engineering doctrine, and then walked back through to return to farming, largely unrecognized beyond narrow military circles. His story raises questions about how many other Morrison equivalents exist in every generation. Individuals whose circumstances force them to develop profound expertise that remains invisible because they lack credentials institutions recognize, or because social hierarchies assume certain categories of people cannot possess certain types of knowledge. The expertise exists, proven by outcomes, but systems designed to identify and deploy expertise systematically miss it. Morrison's own perspective on this remained characteristically pragmatic. In one of his last letters to Colonel Barrett, written in 1969, he reflected on his wartime experience. "You've asked me several times whether I felt the Army properly recognized my contributions, whether I experienced discrimination that limited my effectiveness or advancement. The honest answer is that I don't spend much time thinking about it. I was 62 years old when I joined the agricultural unit, an age when most men are retiring. The work I did helped end the war sooner, which saved lives on all sides. That's sufficient. Whether my name appears in history books, or whether officers credit a black farmer with teaching them about soil, that concerns historians and officers more than it concerns me. The land doesn't care about credit, and I've spent my life learning from land." This pragmatism, born from decades navigating systems designed to minimize his agency, should not be mistaken for acceptance of injustice. Morrison's indifference to historical recognition coexisted with acute awareness of structural inequity. He spent his post-war years supporting civil rights initiatives in Mississippi, leveraging the modest financial success his farming achieved to fund educational opportunities for black students, and quietly mentoring young farmers regardless of race. He recognized that his knowledge had value independent of whether institutions acknowledged it, and he shared that knowledge freely with anyone willing to learn. The rope trap itself, that deceptively simple defensive system, has occasionally been attempted in subsequent conflicts with mixed results. The technique requires very specific geological conditions, saturated peat or similar materials, with marginal load-bearing capacity that can be further degraded through hydraulic modification. These conditions exist in limited geographical areas, making the tactic situational rather than universally applicable. More significantly, successfully implementing it requires the kind of deep terrain knowledge Morrison possessed, understanding that cannot be reduced to simple procedures or taught through brief training. Military institutions, designed to create reproducible capabilities through standardized training, struggle with expertise that depends on decades of accumulated experience and intuitive understanding of complex natural systems. Morrison's manual helped, providing framework and principles, but applying those principles effectively in specific terrain requires judgment that comes only from experience. The Army's solution has been to incorporate agricultural and geological specialists into engineering units, recognizing that certain types of terrain analysis require specific expertise. This represents progress, though implementation remains imperfect. Specialists get integrated into planning, but military culture still sometimes struggles to properly weight their input against conventional intelligence sources or to recognize when local expertise, from farmers, foresters, or others who know the land intimately, might provide capabilities that satellite imagery and geological surveys miss. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.